War once depended on steel and blood, until intelligence itself became the deadliest weapon. In the heart of Britain's Bletchley Park, a quiet mathematician named Alan Turing built a machine that could think faster than any army could move. While bombs fell over Europe, his algorithms turned chaos into clarity, decoding the secrets of the Reich and altering the course of history. Yet the genius who helped end the war would be destroyed by the peace he secured. This is the paradox of victory, when saving humanity demands a mind the world isn't ready to understand. The night smelled of damp paper and burnt circuits. In a small attic above the Oxfordshire countryside, the hum of electricity mingled with the whisper of rain against the windows. The man at the desk adjusted his spectacles, leaned closer to the lamp, and turned the wheel of a peculiar machine. Its keys clacked like the teeth of a clock devouring time. He pressed one key, then another. The bulbs flashed in random sequence, meaningless symbols dancing across the panel. Behind the steady tapping came the faint throb of engines, generators spinning through the darkness of war. Outside, Britain was still burning. London's rooftops glowed in the distance, a reflection of the fires left by the Luftwaffe. Every night, the same ritual unfolded. The sirens, the blackouts, the explosions, and then the silence, broken only by the coded music of Morse. Yet in that room, surrounded by wires and charts, another war was being fought. A war of minds against a machine that had no soul but infinite logic. Would you have trusted numbers more than men if both could mean survival? The device before him had been born long before the bombs. Its story began not in war rooms, but in laboratories, in the restless peace that followed the first great cataclysm. The First World War had turned communication into a weapon. For the first time, armies spoke across continents, and the art of concealment became the art of survival. Messages were disguised, shuffled, and disguised again until they could pass through the air unseen. But men remained fallible. Human ciphers could be guessed, and paper codes could be stolen. In the early 1920s, a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius sought to replace fallibility with machinery. He believed that secrecy could be built from metal and current, that a language could be hidden not by imagination, but by mathematics. He invented a typewriter that lied. When one pressed an A Z might appear, and the next time, something else entirely. Inside were 3 rotors, each carrying 26 contacts wired in tangled sequence. Every keystroke rotated them, altering the electrical path and creating a new letter every instant. With each turn, the world of sense dissolved further into chaos. Its name, Enigma, would prove prophetic. The machine was marketed to bankers, diplomats, and shipping companies. A decade later, it belonged to the German military. By the mid-1930s, its whirring rotors had become the pulse of the Reich's ambitions. Every command from Berlin, every report from the front traveled through it, transformed into streams of letters no enemy could understand. The Germans believed no one ever would. There were 150 million possible settings, a number large enough to inspire worship. Enigma was not only a cipher, it was faith disguised as engineering. While Europe rebuilt its illusions of peace, a few men began to listen. Poland, reborn from the wreckage of empires, stood at the fault line between 2 storms. To its east, the Soviet Union watched and waited. To its west, a rearming Germany murmured of destiny. Between them lay a country with few tanks, but many mathematicians. In Warsaw, inside the Bureau Cyfrow, or Cipher Bureau, officers understood that radio waves carried more than propaganda. They carried the blueprints of invasion. The Bureau's director, Major Guido Langer, realized that this new German encryption machine would decide Poland's survival. He began recruiting not soldiers, but students, young men who could see structure in chaos. Among them was Marian Rejewski, a quiet, unassuming graduate from Poznan University who spoke little but saw deeply. His professors called him the mind that never loses its thread. By 1932, he sat before a pile of intercepted messages, pages of gibberish that had defeated France and Britain alike. The British had abandoned the problem, calling it impossible. The French had no one to attempt it. Poland had one mathematician who believed that impossibility was only a question of logic. Rejewski approached the Enigma as a mathematician might approach an equation. If each substitution followed a pattern, and each pattern changed according to mechanical rhythm, then the problem was not linguistic but algebraic. He turned to group theory, a discipline so abstract that even most mathematicians barely understood it. Through its symbols, he built an invisible model of the machine, a language of cycles and transformations that could describe its inner workings. But intuition alone was not enough. The Poles lacked the wiring of the actual Enigma. Their deductions were trapped behind the veil of secrecy. Then fate sent them a traitor. In 1931, a German army clerk named Hans Thilo Schmidt sold classified Enigma documents to the French Secret Service. The French did not know what to do with them. They passed copies to Warsaw. There, Rejewski laid the diagrams beside his equations and understood that the pieces fit. In a few weeks, he reconstructed the Enigma's internal wiring purely through deduction. It was the most extraordinary cryptographic feat in modern history, achieved not by nations, but by 3 men in their 20s. Together with colleagues Jerzy Rożycki and Henryk Zygalski, Rejewski built a Polish Enigma from scratch and watched, astonished, as the lamps began to spell sense from chaos. By 1933, they could read German military messages almost as soon as they were sent. The unbreakable code was broken. For 7 years, they read the Reich in secret. Every new procedure forced them to adapt, every new rota to recalculate. They built mechanical aids, punched cards, and a device they called the Bomber Kryptologiczna, an automated machine that mimicked the logic of the German device. But as the decade darkened, their success became a burden. Poland stood alone between 2 powers that would soon erase it from the map, and its cryptologists knew that their victory would die with them unless it could be passed on. By the summer of 1939, the signals in the air had grown frantic. German orders swarmed across the ether like insects before rain. The Cipher Bureau could still read them, but the rhythm had changed. Something vast was coming. On July 25th, deep in a forest near Warsaw, Polish officers met secretly with British and French intelligence. They opened wooden crates and revealed their secret, complete replicas of the Enigma machine, built from logic and desperation. The British delegation was stunned. The Poles had achieved in silence what their own experts had called impossible. 6 weeks later, the world ended. German tanks crossed the Vistula. Warsaw fell. The Cipher Bureau fled south carrying what fragments of their work they could. Some escaped to France under false names, others vanished in exile. Yet the knowledge survived. The flame they carried, equations, methods, designs, would ignite again in England, in a quiet mansion known only by a letter, X. The man in the attic, years later, would inherit that flame. He would study the Polish diagrams, examine the gears, and imagine a new kind of intelligence, one that could think faster than any human. His name was Alan Turing, though that part of the story had not yet begun. For now, the machine still ruled. Its rotors turned endlessly across Europe, spelling orders that sealed the fate of nations. Every assault, every invasion, every death convoy began as a pattern of light on an Enigma keyboard. Each time an operator pressed a key, history changed by a single letter. And somewhere beyond the reach of gunfire, unseen listeners strained to hear what the enemy was saying, and wondered if numbers alone could stop a war. The codebreakers of Warsaw vanished with the city's light. When the first German shells fell in September 1939, the Cipher Bureau packed its machines into wooden crates, loaded them onto trucks, and drove south through fields already on fire. Behind them, the air pulsed with their own intercepted frequencies, the voices of armies closing in. By the time the last train left the capital, the Bureau no longer existed. Its mathematicians crossed into Romania under false passports, carrying nothing but notebooks filled with equations and the memory of a secret that had outlived their country. In France, the survivors regrouped under the name PC Bruno, hidden among the forests near Paris. There, in drafty villas and makeshift sheds, they tried to rebuild what Warsaw had lost. German ciphers still filled the air, but the signals had changed. New plugboard settings, extra rotors, and unfamiliar call signs blurred the pattern. Rejewski and his colleagues began again from nothing, haunted by the sound of the language they could still read in fragments. They worked quietly, while the world above them believed Poland had ceased to think. Britain, meanwhile, was waking to its own isolation. Within weeks of the invasion of Poland, France's frontier trembled and the North Sea convoys burned. The British government, which had dismissed the Enigma problem for nearly a decade, suddenly faced an enemy whose every movement was orchestrated by invisible command. The nation's fate, Churchill would later admit, now depended on what we could not hear. The Government Code and Cipher School, a modest pre-war office in London, was ordered to expand overnight. Its director, Alistair Denniston, understood that traditional cryptography would not survive this conflict. The age of language experts was ending. The war demanded mathematicians. A country built on industry and empire would now rely on abstraction and intuition. In the winter of 1938, before the shooting began, Denniston had already scouted an unlikely headquarters, an estate 50 miles north of London, surrounded by quiet farmland and fog. The house was neither imposing nor modern. Its chimneys leaned, its walls creaked, and its lawns smelled of rain. Yet its position, close to the railway and far from enemy bombers, made it ideal. The address was erased from official records and replaced by a single designation, Station X. When the first staff arrived, the house stood nearly empty, its floors scattered with dust and ration crates. They set up desks in drawing rooms, ran cables through fireplaces, and filled the corridors with typewriters. Outside, carpenters raised a collection of wooden huts that would soon grow like a small city. Each hut was numbered, each door guarded, each task compartmentalized. No one outside a single wall was supposed to know what anyone else inside was doing. The war's greatest intelligence center began with blackout curtains and borrowed furniture. Recruits arrived by quiet trains. They were not soldiers. Some were classics scholars, others mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, Egyptologists, and cryptic crossword fanatics. One candidate was reportedly hired after finishing a puzzle faster than his interviewer. Another arrived still wearing an academic gown. They came from Cambridge, Oxford, and forgotten provincial colleges, drawn by letters that revealed nothing about the work ahead. Many assumed they were being trained as radio operators. Only when the doors closed behind them did they learn that their real enemy was a machine. Among those called was Alan Matheson Turing, a shy Cambridge mathematician whose mind moved in patterns few could follow. Before the war, he had written a paper describing a theoretical machine capable of performing any calculation that could be expressed in logic, a vision of mechanical thought. Now, that abstraction would find its test in steel. When he arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939, carrying a bicycle, a gas mask, and a notebook filled with equations, few noticed him. Within months, the fate of the British war effort would rest on his ideas. At first, the new recruits could only study what the Poles had left behind. The materials from the Warsaw handoff, rotor wiring tables, diagrams, and notes, had survived in French custody and been forwarded to London. Rejewski's equations were translated and circulated among the mathematicians of Hut 6, the section assigned to Army and Air Force Enigma. They became both foundation and mystery, fragments of a method without its inventor. Turing spent long nights tracing the logic, learning to think as the Polish codebreakers had, then pushing beyond them. If human reason had once unraveled Enigma, he believed, only mechanical reason could now keep pace. The first intercepts arrived from the network of listening posts called Y stations. From cabins along Britain's coasts and colonies, operators copied endless streams of German radio traffic, thousands of groups of five-letter gibberish, written by hand and ferried by motorcycle to Bletchley. Piles of paper grew across the huts. Every message represented a potential convoy, an attack, a bombing run. None could yet be read. Morale dipped as the war darkened. By the spring of 1940, Denmark and Norway had fallen, and France was collapsing. Britain stood alone, watching the Channel as if it were already an open grave. Inside Bletchley Park, failure felt intimate. Every unread signal was a shadowed ship. Every delay, another city set aflame. The cryptologists slept under their desks, drank too much tea, and worked through the blackout. "We are listening to the war itself," one operator wrote, "but we cannot answer it." Turing believed the problem was speed. Human analysis could never traverse the astronomical combinations of Enigma's rotors before the Germans changed their settings each dawn. The solution, he reasoned, was to mechanize thought itself, to create a device that would test each possibility faster than any mind could. He began designing a machine built not to copy Enigma, but to hunt it, an electromechanical engine of logic that would one day be called the bomb. But before it could exist, he needed proof that the system could still be attacked at all. That proof came from France. As the German advance tightened around Paris, the remnants of P.C. Bruno fled south with their records. In the chaos, they managed to pass on fresh intercepts and procedural notes to the British attachés. Among the papers was confirmation that the Germans had recently increased the Enigma's complexity with additional plugboard cables, yet the underlying structure remained the same. The Poles had been right. The machine could evolve, but it could not escape its own mathematics. The information arrived at Bletchley in June 1940, days before France fell. Within a month, Churchill would call that desperate summer their finest hour. For the codebreakers, it was a beginning. They now possessed enough fragments to rebuild the enemy's daily keys, and a mandate that could no longer be questioned. Station X expanded like a living organism. New huts appeared weekly, teleprinter lines hummed, motorbikes roared in with dispatches from the Y stations at all hours. Each section specialized. Hut 3 analyzed decrypted intelligence. Hut 6 attacked Army Enigma, and soon Hut 8 would focus on the Navy. The codebreakers moved between them like ghosts, speaking in abbreviations and initials that meant nothing to the outside world. Even inside the park, secrecy ruled. A mathematician might sit 10 feet from a linguist for years without knowing what the other truly did. Discipline gave way to obsession. Some workers remained at their desks for 40-hour stretches. Others refused to leave until the day's intercepts yielded a pattern. One young woman remembered the sound of the generators vibrating through the walls, a constant reminder that the machines never slept. It felt, she wrote later, as if we were inside the brain of something vast. In the midst of exhaustion, small victories appeared. German operators who repeated call signs, weather reports that contained predictable phrases, careless habits that opened cracks in the armor of Enigma. These fragments, called cribs, became the lifeblood of the attack. From them, patterns emerged. Logic began to answer logic. By late 1940, Turing's first prototype of the bomb was taking shape at the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth. As engineers assembled its drums and circuits, the air war over Britain reached its height. Above the countryside, searchlights crossed like blades. Below, the rooms of Bletchley Park glowed dimly behind blackout curtains. When the all-clear siren finally sounded, work resumed without pause. No one at Station X spoke publicly of what they were building. Outside its gates, few even knew the place existed. But within its narrow corridors, among the smell of oil and ink and damp paper, something unprecedented was forming. A community of minds bound by secrecy, ingenuity, and fatigue. Each believed that if they could pierce the Enigma once more, Britain might survive long enough to strike back. The last trains from London arrived past midnight, bringing more recruits, more intercepts, more unbroken strings of letters. The war of machines was expanding, and the machine was winning. Yet inside Hut 6, a mathematician stood over a diagram of gears and relays, imagining movement faster than thought. The world outside waited for invasion. He was already building the counterattack. Before the year ended, the quiet of Bletchley Park would give birth to the first true fusion of man and mechanism, a partnership that would change both the war and the future itself. Europe fell faster than anyone believed possible. When German panzers crossed the Polish frontier, they did so with a speed that defied maps. Cities surrendered before their names reached London. In the skies above Warsaw, bombers followed paths guided not by luck, but by coordination. Orders transmitted through the invisible lattice of Enigma. Within 3 weeks, Poland's army was divided, its borders erased, its messages silent. But a few of its cryptologists were still alive, moving west under assumed names, carrying the knowledge that the German code was not divine. Their escape was the first act in a new kind of resistance, one measured not in miles, but in patterns. France became their refuge. The team that had broken Enigma once now hid in a chateau near Paris, its halls lined with radios and chalkboards. They called their new home P.C. Bruno. There, Marian Rejewski and his colleagues listened to the same frequencies they had known in Warsaw, only now the signals multiplied as the Reich expanded. Each intercept was a reminder of the world collapsing around them: Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, all falling with the same mechanical precision that their equations had once described. From the north came another sound, the rolling thunder of German armor. Blitzkrieg, they called it, lightning war. Tanks and aircraft striking in synchronized bursts, converging on their targets like the gears of an engine. The brilliance of the tactic lay not only in steel, but in communication. Each unit knew exactly when to move, because each message arrived intact, encrypted by the same device that Poland had warned the Allies about. and that they had been too slow to understand. By May 1940, the Wehrmacht was racing toward the English Channel. French defences cracked in days. British soldiers fled to Dunkirk, leaving their equipment in the sand. Across the Channel, Britain stood suddenly alone. Her cities exposed, her navy overstretched, her allies gone. "We shall fight on the beaches," Churchill declared. But in the radio rooms of the Admiralty, another question loomed. How can we fight what we cannot read? The first answer came from the quiet fields of Buckinghamshire. Bletchley Park had now become the beating heart of Britain's invisible war. The wooden huts multiplied until they formed a small labyrinth. Each smelled of damp paper, ink, and exhaustion. Inside Hut 6, Turing's mathematics met the stubborn rhythm of intercepted traffic. Across the courtyard, Hut 3 turned whatever fragments they could decipher into intelligence reports for the armed forces. The process was so compartmentalized that one team rarely knew what another had achieved. It was secrecy feeding secrecy, a fortress built from silence. At first, there was only failure. The German military had altered the Enigma's procedures again, adding more plugboard cables, new rotor orders, and stricter discipline. Each morning at midnight, the cipher keys changed, rendering the previous day's breakthroughs worthless. The operators of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht followed their instructions with mechanical precision. Even when Britain's intercept stations filled the air with captured messages, they remained as unreadable as the first ones Poland had intercepted a decade earlier. Inside the huts, morale wavered. Messages arrived by the thousands, typed, catalogued, and filed in cabinets that grew heavier each week. For the linguists, it was a purgatory of noise. For the mathematicians, an impossible equation renewed daily. Some worked themselves to collapse. Others simply stopped speaking. "We are drowning in letters," one clerk wrote, "and none of them form words." Then, almost by accident, a weakness appeared. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, prided itself on order, and order breeds repetition. Weather stations transmitted daily forecasts with the same phrase, Wetterbericht für morgen, weather report for tomorrow. Each time those words were encrypted, they produced a familiar rhythm inside the cipher text. These predictable fragments became what the codebreakers called cribs, footholds in the mountain of permutations. A single repeated phrase could reveal how the rotors had been set, if one had the patience to test every possibility. Patience, however, was the one thing Bletchley lacked. Turing realized that no number of clerks could perform such testing by hand. The answer had to be mechanical, a device that could try combinations automatically until one produced coherent German. He sketched a system of rotating drums wired to simulate the logic of several enigmas running in parallel. Each drum represented a rotor. Each movement tested a new possibility. The machine would not solve the code. It would eliminate impossibilities until only truth remained. He called his design the bomb. To build it, the government turned to the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth, where engineers who had once manufactured accounting devices now began crafting the engine of logic. Under the supervision of Harold Keane and Gordon Welchman, Turing's theoretical sketches became rows of metal cylinders, wires, and switches, each whirring in sync like an orchestra of precision. When activated, the bomb's drums spun through thousands of combinations each minute, searching for the narrow thread of coherence within chaos. As Turing's invention took form, the war outside reached its most perilous point. German bombers crossed the Channel nightly, turning London into a furnace. From their rooftops, civilians watched the sky ripple with flak while beneath them. In basements and shelters, radios whispered the Morse chatter of Luftwaffe coordination. In those same nights, Bletchley Park's generators hummed without pause. The battle for the city above was mirrored by the battle of signals below. Through that summer, Britain's darkest, the park became a nation in miniature. The Women's Royal Naval Service, known as the Wrens, joined by the hundreds, operating typewriters and sorting intercepts. University professors worked beside teenage typists. Cryptographers who had never handled a weapon now found themselves in charge of intelligence that could decide where ships would sail and where men would die. The strain was immense, the secrecy absolute. Even spouses were forbidden to know what was done inside the gates. Each success, when it came, was fleeting. Occasionally, a careless German operator reused a key or sent a message twice. From these mistakes came small victories. A fragment decoded here, a call sign there. Enough to predict a raid or save a convoy. Yet for every triumph, there were thousands of failures. The codebreakers learned to measure their days not by hours, but by clues. Every pattern discovered was a heartbeat of progress. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Polish Bureau had made their way to Vichy, France, continuing their work in secrecy. They built small laboratories under the codename Cadix, operating under constant threat of arrest. Communication with Britain was dangerous, but not impossible. Through intermediaries, the Poles confirmed that their methods still held value, though the Enigma had evolved beyond what they could access. In London, Turing and Denniston quietly ensured that these early pioneers would not be forgotten. Without them, none of this would have existed. By late 1940, the first bombes began to run. Their noise filled an entire hall, a metallic thunder of rotating drums and relays. Operators monitored the readouts, waiting for the moment when the machine stopped and a lamp flickered, signaling a possible key. Sometimes it took hours, sometimes minutes. Sometimes the day ended in silence. Yet the sound of the bomb itself was victory, proof that human thought could be multiplied by motion. As winter settled over the English countryside, the results began to arrive in fragments. Luftwaffe communications, once unreadable, started to yield sentences. Messages from bomber groups revealed weather reports, coordinates, and timetables. Though the decryption was incomplete and delayed, it gave the Royal Air Force its first glimpse into the rhythm of enemy attacks. The men in the skies rarely knew it, but the patterns guiding their defenses were born from the glow of the lamps inside Bletchley Park. Outside, the war still looked hopeless. Europe belonged to Hitler, and the Atlantic had become a graveyard of ships. Yet for the first time, Britain possessed a secret as powerful as the enemy's confidence, a way to listen. The balance of intelligence had begun to shift, not enough to end the war, but enough to believe it could be ended. Bletchley Park's workers were forbidden celebration. Each morning at midnight, the Germans changed their keys, and the race began again. The victories of yesterday became useless at dawn. Still they worked through the drone of the generators and the tremor of air raid sirens, convinced that if they could break the code faster, they might shorten the night. When Churchill visited the park for the first time, he called them the geese that lay the golden eggs and never cackled. Few there heard the praise. It was classified. Their success would remain hidden for decades. But that autumn, as bombs fell over London and searchlights crossed the sky, a quiet certainty took root among the huts. The machine that once ruled the war was beginning to serve its enemies. And deep within the wooden walls of Hut 8, Alan Turing watched the drums of his invention turn and listened to the hum of what he had created. In that sound, he heard the first faint reply to the rhythm of the Enigma. the echo of human reason answering the call of the machine. The machines did not rest. Night after night, the drums of the bombers turned through their endless combinations, while the operators, mostly young women of the Wrens, listened to the metallic heartbeat of logic. They sat in long rows beneath the humming cables, marking readouts by hand, their faces pale under fluorescent light. When a lamp froze on a letter, it meant possibility. When the drums stopped, it meant hope. Each pause in the rhythm might have been the line that separated survival from loss somewhere at sea. By 1941, Britain had become an island of endurance. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air, but in the Atlantic, the war was still being lost. German U-boats hunted convoys like wolves. Every merchant ship sunk meant fewer rifles, fewer rations, fewer gallons of fuel for the planes that still guarded the sky. And each U-boat was guided by messages encrypted through the most sophisticated form of Enigma yet devised, the naval Enigma, or shark. The challenge was unlike any before. The naval version used different procedures, additional plugboard pairs, and tighter discipline. Errors that had betrayed the Luftwaffe were absent here. To the men of Bletchley Park, the ocean itself seemed to speak in an unbreakable code. The newly formed Hut 8, placed under Alan Turing's leadership, was created for this purpose alone. Its task, to break the Navy's Enigma and map the positions of U-boats before they struck. Turing shared command with the chess prodigy Hugh Alexander, a man whose calm precision contrasted Turing's restless abstraction. Their combined method was simple in theory, merciless in practice, an unending search for order hidden within apparent disorder. The first months brought nothing but defeat. Convoys vanished mid-Atlantic without warning. Oil slicks and wreckage arrived on British shores. Bletchley's intercepts multiplied, but they remained dead on the page. Even the bombs struggled. The added naval rotors produced billions more possibilities, and the machine could not search them fast enough. Operators worked double shifts, feeding endless sheets of cipher into the system, chasing meaning through noise. Sometimes, late at night, when the last light in the hut burned low, the walls themselves seemed to hum with frustration. Outside the park, the war was collapsing toward catastrophe. France had fallen. Across the channel, the Gestapo confiscated code books from captured transmitters. The Polish cryptologists who had fled Warsaw now fled again. Rejewski, Rojicki, and Zygalski moved south toward the unoccupied zone, carrying only what they could hide. They eventually re-established a small station near Marseille under the codename Cadix. From there, they continued the same work they had begun in Poland a decade earlier, now surrounded by enemy territory. Their reports reached Britain through fragments and couriers, confirming what Bletchley already feared, that Enigma had grown more complex than ever. The codebreakers responded not with despair, but with invention. Turing and Welchman redesigned the bomb, introducing a new component they called the diagonal board, which allowed the machine to test multiple logical paths simultaneously. What once took days could now be done in hours. The mechanical noise increased to a deafening roar, but within that noise lay the rhythm of discovery. Slowly, methodically, the bombers began producing consistent results against the Luftwaffe traffic again. It was not victory, but it was progress. Inside the huts, discipline became ritual. The day began and ended with intercepts, piles of 5-letter groups, copied by Y-station operators who often never knew what they were hearing. Motorcycles arrived at dawn, carrying sacks of messages wrapped in oilcloth. Clerks counted, stamped, and distributed them. Linguists searched for repeated phrases, Mathematicians translated them into logical diagrams. Engineers converted those diagrams into machine settings. Every part of the process depended on every other, and none of it could be explained outside the gates. Secrecy was no longer a rule, but an instinct. Life at Bletchley Park existed outside ordinary time. Meals were irregular, clocks were meaningless. Workers lived in a haze of fatigue and adrenaline, their minds half in German syntax and half in algebra. They spoke in fragments, abbreviations, initials, keys, cribs, steckers, rings. Each night, when they left their huts, the blackout covered the park in silence, except for the low, constant hum of the generators. To anyone passing by, it was just another estate swallowed by war. To those within, it was the mind of Britain itself, thinking faster each day. Turing remained an enigma to his colleagues. He cycled to work with his trousers clipped by paper clips and his gas mask strapped on during pollen season. He drank mugs of tea balanced on circuit boards and, more often than not, forgot to speak during meals. Yet behind his distracted manner lay a focus that frightened those who understood it. He treated the enigma not as an opponent, but as a problem of logic that would, by its nature, eventually reveal itself. When asked once how he could endure the monotony of testing millions of false keys, he replied only, "Because one of them is true." His belief proved right sooner than anyone expected. In the spring of 1941, a German operator committed a tiny, fatal error. He sent a message twice with the same key, changing only a single letter. It was the kind of mistake the Navy's manual explicitly forbade, but fatigue and routine had eroded discipline even in the Reich's most secret branch. The duplicate transmission reached a Y station in Scarborough and was rushed to Bletchley by night train. Within hours, Turing and Alexander identified the overlap. For the first time, the structure of naval Enigma cracked open. The machine that had blinded Britain's convoys began to speak in fragments. It was not enough to win the Battle of the Atlantic, but it was enough to believe it could be won. Decoded messages revealed the movements of a few wolf packs, the composition of a few patrols. The Admiralty could reroute convoys in time to avoid ambushes. Losses decreased for a week, then a month. In the endless calculus of war, even a few saved ships were miracles measured in lives. Then disaster returned. In early June 1941, the Germans added a fourth rotor to the naval Enigma, increasing its permutations beyond the reach of the bombs. Once again, the messages turned to unreadable noise. Hut 8 went dark. The operators could only listen to the drums spin in futility. Some nights, they simply turned the machines off to save power. The Atlantic became silent again, but only for the Allies. What followed was the hardest season Bletchley ever faced. The warships that had relied on ultra-intelligence were suddenly blind. In the North Atlantic, entire convoys were lost. The names of the ships blurred into casualty lists. Turing, exhausted, considered abandoning the naval problem altogether. His colleagues convinced him otherwise. "We've seen the pattern once," Alexander told him. "We'll see it again." It was not encouragement so much as defiance. They returned to work. Outside the huts, the war's theater widened. Germany turned east and invaded the Soviet Union, flooding the airwaves with new ciphers. Italy entered the Mediterranean conflict, using a naval enigma of its own. Each front added another layer to the labyrinth of signals. The park expanded to meet it. Dozens of new bombers were built across secret sites in Britain, from Wavendon to Stanmore. The noise of their rotation became the soundtrack of a nation at war. At last, fortune shifted. In May 1941, The Royal Navy captured a German U-boat, U-110, and recovered its cipher books intact. The material reached Bletchley within days. Turing used the documents to reconstruct the four-rotor logic. By summer, Hut 8 could read sections of Naval Enigma again. From those decrypts came the first detailed maps of U-boat positions, the first clear understanding of how Admiral Dönitz controlled his fleets. It was the difference between blindness and sight. The breakthrough did not end the peril. Convoys still vanished and men still died in freezing water, but it marked the moment when the tide of information began to flow backward toward Britain. In a war where every weapon was running out, planes, fuel, ships, knowledge itself became ammunition. And Bletchley Park, unseen and unnamed, was now the arsenal that produced it. By autumn, the codebreakers had learned to live between success and failure. Each victory lasted only until midnight, when the Germans changed their settings again. Each morning began at 0. The young women of the Wrens wound the bombs for another day. The mathematicians sharpened pencils and returned to their equations. The motorbikes arrived with new bundles of ciphertext. Outside the gates, the rain fell, as it had on every English morning since the war began. Inside, the hum of the machines continued, relentless and cold, as if the war itself were thinking through them. They did not know it yet, but their patient noise had already begun to shorten the war. For the first time in history, the battle for the world's future was being decided by logic circuits, spinning wheels, and the human will to understand what was never meant to be understood. And as winter approached, that quiet war of codes was only beginning to reveal how much could be won by those who refused to speak of victory at all. The room shook with a sound that was not quite mechanical and not quite human. A steady, rolling thunder of logic. Inside the brick outbuilding on the edge of Bletchley Park, 64 drums turned in synchrony, their shafts gleaming under harsh light. Wires hung from the ceiling like roots. The air smelled of hot oil and ozone. At the far end of the hall stood a man in a rumpled jacket, watching his creation move as if it were breathing. Each rotation was a thought made visible. Each click was a question asked and answered at impossible speed. This was the first Bombay, and it was alive. Alan Turing had imagined it months earlier, sketching its circuitry on scraps of paper during the blackouts. He had wanted not a machine that mimicked men, but one that could outthink them. His reasoning was brutally simple. The Germans changed Enigma settings every 24 hours. Therefore, the British had 24 hours to rediscover them. No team of human analysts could test the 10 quadrillion possible combinations before the clock struck midnight. Only a machine could compress days into hours. Only a machine could learn to think in rhythm with war. The logic of the bomb was not deduction, but elimination. Instead of searching for the right answer, it searched for all the wrong ones and discarded them. What remained, however improbable, had to be true. Each rotation of the drums simulated dozens of Enigma machines running side by side, checking possible rotor orders against a chosen crib, a word or phrase suspected to appear in a message. When the electrical circuits aligned without contradiction, the machine stopped. A lamp glowed. Somewhere in the chaos of signals, the pattern had been found. The first time the bomb halted successfully, the operators burst into applause. They were young Wrens, barely out of school, hands blackened with graphite from note-taking. They worked 12-hour shifts in windowless rooms, their ears dulled by the constant metallic hum. Yet when the lamp lit, they felt as if they had heard the enemy speak. Turing's triumph, however, was not solitary. Gordon Welchman, a mathematician from Cambridge, studied the bomb's schematics and proposed an addition that would double its efficiency: the diagonal board. By linking equivalent logical positions across the circuits, the machine could rule out contradictions faster, accelerating the search by orders of magnitude. It was a small wooden panel studded with brass plugs, an object of almost monastic simplicity. But it transformed the bomb from a clever idea into a weapon. Together, Turing and Welchman had built something the world had never seen: an electromechanical mind that could reason through permutations. By late 1941, the network of bomb bays had multiplied. New models operated in secret outposts across southern England, their rotations synchronized like the beating of many hearts. The staff called them by names: Agnus Dei, Victory, Phoenix, as if each possessed a soul. Messages arrived by the thousands from the Y stations, endless pages of 5-letter groups copied from Morse. Once meaningless, now they passed through the bombers and emerged transformed, first as fragments, then as full sentences, finally as understanding. For the first time, Luftwaffe Enigma was being read systematically. Turing's machines broke the daily keys often enough to keep pace with the war in the air. The decrypted messages, stamped ultra-secret, were sent by motorcycle to the Air Ministry and the Admiralty before dawn. Each one carried decisions: where to deploy fighters, which convoys to divert, which airfields to strike before they struck first. The men who acted on them rarely knew their origin. The intelligence was simply labeled from a reliable source. Inside Bletchley Park, exhaustion became a way of life. The mathematicians worked among the wrens, their desks littered with tea mugs, rotor diagrams, and half-burnt cigarettes. Conversations blurred into half-sentences, rotor 2 swapped, plug 6 misset. The day had no real beginning or end. The only measure of time was the sound of the bombers slowing down, stopping, starting again. Secrecy demanded that none of this leave the park. Letters home spoke only of clerical work. Parents and friends imagined dull offices. Few guessed that their children were intercepting the mind of the Reich. Even within Bletchley, compartmentalization ruled. Those in Hut 6, focused on the Army and Air Force ciphers, were forbidden to know what Hut 8 was doing with the Navy's Enigma. Analysts who might have shared lunch avoided asking questions that could not be answered. The silence was absolute, yet within it something extraordinary was forming. A collective intelligence, hundreds of minds thinking as one. Among them, Turing remained the strangest presence, brilliant, forgetful, and sometimes painfully shy. He rarely looked people in the eye, spoke in short bursts, and seemed perpetually distracted by ideas no one else could follow. But when he explained a concept, the room fell still. To him, the bomb bay was not merely a tool of war. It was a proof of something deeper, that reasoning itself could be mechanized, that thought could exist in circuits. A machine can do anything that can be described, he once said, half to himself. In that remark lay the seed of everything that would follow after the war. For now, the machines served a single purpose: to keep Britain alive. Each successful decryption revealed the habits of an enemy convinced of its own invulnerability. German pilots opened every transmission with "Heil Hitler," a phrase so common that it became a favorite crib at Bletchley. Weather reports followed predictable formats, giving the bombs an initial grip on the day's key. Even small details, the way operators repeated introductions or used the same code words for locations, became cracks in the armor of secrecy. To the code breakers, these human flaws were gifts. They called them the kindness of the enemy. As the flow of intelligence increased, so did the moral burden. The decrypts were precise, sometimes devastating. A report might reveal the coordinates of a bomber group, leading to an ambush that left hundreds dead. Another might arrive too late to save a convoy already destroyed. The people at Bletchley worked in the knowledge that their success and their failures alike cost lives. Yet they could never speak of either. They celebrated in silence, grieved in silence, and returned to work. Among the first fruits of the new system came a victory that echoed far beyond its immediate scale. In early 1941, messages intercepted from the Italian Navy, using a variant of Enigma, were deciphered by Dilly Knox and a young cryptanalyst named Mavis Beatty. The intelligence revealed the position of the Italian fleet preparing to attack British ships near Cape Matapan. Admiral Andrew Cunningham used the information to launch a surprise counterattack. The result was devastating. 3 Italian cruisers sunk, thousands lost. The press called it a triumph of naval tactics. Only a handful of people knew it had begun with a code. That success electrified Bletchley. It proved that ultra-intelligence, as the stream of decrypts was now codenamed, could shape real battles. Within weeks, new requests flooded in from the Admiralty, the RAF, and the War Office. Every commander wanted the invisible advantage. The park expanded again. More huts, more bombs, more wrens. The quiet mansion that had once housed a few hundred thinkers now held thousands. From the air, it looked like an ordinary estate. From within, it felt like the center of gravity in a war that spanned continents. The victories were measured not in headlines, but in days of survival. Britain's supply lines held through the winter of 1941 to 42. The Luftwaffe's raids, once relentless, grew erratic. Each time a bomber formation was intercepted, each time a convoy reached port unharmed, the codebreakers knew, though they could never say, that the lamp that had glowed on the bomb hours earlier had made the difference. And still, they pushed further. For Turing, the bomb was only the beginning. He began sketching designs for machines that could process logic more flexibly, unbound from the limits of Enigma. He spoke of universal computation, of devices that could perform any task describable in symbols. His colleagues humored him. The war was too immediate to think of futures. Yet the idea lingered, like an afterimage of the lamp that flickered when the right answer appeared. Outside Bletchley Park, the war was changing shape. Hitler turned his armies east toward Russia. Japan gathered in the Pacific. The world widened, and so did the field of signals. But within the English countryside, among the hum of relays and the smell of burning dust, a small group of men and women had done something unprecedented. They had taught a machine to reason, and in doing so had proven that thought itself could be a weapon. When the bombers' drums slowed at dawn, Turing sometimes remained alone, listening to the last clicks echo through the hall. To others, it was only a machine winding down. To him, it was something closer to a heartbeat. Beyond the walls, bombers crossed the sky toward distant cities. The lights of Bletchley glowed dimly against the blackout. The war would go on, but now, at last, there was a rhythm answering back. The pulse of human logic keeping time with history. By 1942, Bletchley Park had become a city disguised as a secret. The lawns where officers once took photographs were now buried under huts, telephone lines, and generators that never slept. Even the trees seemed to hum. The park's expansion mirrored the war's own transformation. From a contest of armies to a contest of systems. In a conflict that spanned oceans, the victors would not be the strongest, but the fastest to think. The bombers were multiplying faster than anyone had imagined. What began as a handful of prototypes had become an industrial project. New machines appeared weekly, each larger and louder than the last. They filled outbuildings, garages, and abandoned cinemas across Britain. Their wiring consumed copper by the mile. Their drums turned day and night, spitting out keys and possibilities. Operators learned to interpret the rhythm by sound alone. A steady whir for searching, a sharp click for stopping. The sound became the metronome of the hidden war. To feed these machines, Britain created a vast network of Y stations, listening posts stretching from Scotland to the Mediterranean. Operators tuned their receivers to the German frequencies, scribbling Morse in cramped notebooks while bombers passed overhead. Messages travelled from the coast to Bletchley by motorbike, train, and pneumatic tube. Each sheet of gibberish was a fragment of thought stolen from the enemy. The entire system was alive, pulsating between human hands and mechanical gears, between silence and revelation. Among the thousands who kept it alive were the Wrens, the women of the Women's Royal Naval Service. They were the true operators of the bombs, the ones who turned theory into motion. In dimly lit halls, they tended the machines in shifts that lasted 12 hours or more, adjusting switches, recording stops, changing drums slick with oil. They worked in heat and noise, often without knowing what the machines were doing or why it mattered. Yet they understood one thing. When the bomb halted, lives were being saved somewhere far away. The rhythm of Bletchley's days no longer followed the calendar of the outside world. It followed the German midnight. At each dawn, the enemy changed his keys, and the chase began anew. The park woke before sunrise. Messages arrived before breakfast. Tea cooled beside stacks of intercepts. Pencils dulled and snapped. The air smelled of carbon and fatigue. Breakthroughs came suddenly and vanished as quickly. A week of success, followed by a month of blindness. But the process itself had become the only constant. The park was now a mind of its own, analytical, obsessive, self-correcting. The weight of secrecy pressed harder than the work. No one beyond the perimeter fences could know what happened inside. Husbands, wives, and parents received only the same vague explanations. Clerical service, statistical work, communications analysis. Even those within Bletchley knew little beyond their own hut. To ask a question was to risk security. To speculate was to commit an offense. The result was a kind of institutional solitude. Thousands of people thinking side by side, yet never together. And at the center of it all, the mind that had built the machines was beginning to strain under its own invention. Alan Turing worked relentlessly. The bombs answered his calculations faster than he had dreamed, yet he felt the limits of the system closing in. Each new rotor added by the Germans erased months of progress. To keep pace, he redesigned the machines again and again, drafting new circuits, new logical shortcuts, new patterns of search. He had become both creator and captive of the mechanism. The hum of the bombers followed him everywhere, a sound he once called the heartbeat of reason. To others, it was the sound of exhaustion. He rarely slept. His colleagues found him at his desk long after midnight, surrounded by papers covered in symbols, the air thick with tobacco and silence. Those who worked beside him remembered his contradictions. Shy yet abrupt, detached yet deeply compassionate. When a Wren operator once fell asleep beside a running bomb bay, he covered her with his coat and kept working. He seemed to inhabit another realm entirely, one where emotion and logic were not opposites, but part of the same problem. By the spring of 1942, The machines were delivering intelligence at a scale no one could have predicted. Decrypts arrived hourly, each labeled Ultra and marked with a crimson stamp. They revealed not only troop movements and bombing plans, but fragments of conversation, personal messages, even jokes between operators on the German front. For the first time in history, one side in a war was reading the other's mind almost in real time. Yet this success brought a new dilemma. How much could they act on what they knew? If the Admiralty changed convoy routes too often, the Germans might suspect that Enigma was compromised. If the RAF intercepted a formation every time a message revealed its target, the enemy would sense a leak. Intelligence had to be used sparingly, invisibly. The hardest task of all was to do nothing when doing nothing meant lives lost. Bletchley Park became not only the world's greatest producer of knowledge, but its most disciplined suppressor. Victory depended on silence. The moral strain was heavy, especially on those who saw the decrypted messages firsthand. Some revealed the sinking of ships whose crews were known by name. Others contained lists of captured resistance members or orders for executions in occupied Europe. The analysts read them, translated them, filed them, and went back to work. Their only solace was the belief that every code broken might shorten the war, that every day saved could mean thousands spared. Turing carried that weight more privately than most. He once told a colleague that the moral logic of war was the same as the logic of code breaking. You can't see the whole picture, only what the pattern allows. To him, the tragedy was part of the system. His machines did not distinguish between messages of victory or despair. They simply sought truth. In that impartiality, he found both purpose and loneliness. Yet the results were undeniable. Through 1942, the Luftwaffe's coordination faltered. German bombing raids grew less precise, their supply lines thinner. The intelligence born in Hut 6 began to reach the field fast enough to matter. In North Africa, British commanders received decoded German signals revealing the plans of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Convoys were rerouted, ambushes prepared, attacks repelled. The Desert War began to turn, quietly, invisibly, under the guidance of minds that the soldiers at the front would never meet. Every triumph inside Bletchley was followed by another wave of work. The flow of intercepts doubled as the Allies advanced. More bombs were ordered, one every few weeks. The British Tabulating Machine Company worked around the clock, its engineers now as secret as the cryptologists themselves. The line between science and warfare had vanished completely. Britain was building an empire of logic. Among the newcomers to the park was Joan Clark, a mathematician who quickly proved one of Turing's few equals in pure reasoning. Together, they analyzed the structure of naval Enigma, identifying recurring patterns in the key tables. Their collaboration was intense, sometimes wordless, always brilliant. Clark's intuition complemented Turing's precision. Where he saw formulae, she saw rhythm. Together they found new ways to anticipate the German key changes before midnight, cutting hours off each day's race. The friendship between them grew into mutual affection, though Turing, bound by secrets of his own, could never explain the distance that followed. Through that year, the park became a place of paradox. It was both mechanical and human, driven by reason and haunted by emotion. In the glow of the machines, people fell in love, argued, broke down, and began again. Every day ended the same way. The clocks striking 12, the Germans resetting their ciphers, the bomb bears starting over from zero. For all their intellect, the code breakers lived in repetition. Their victories erased nightly, their work rewritten by dawn. Outside, the the world began to sense change. Convoys reached Britain more safely. The air raids grew less frequent. Churchill, reading the ultra summaries each morning, called the intelligence the golden eggs. He never mentioned the geese who laid them. The public, unaware of their existence, simply believed in luck, in courage, in the will of a nation that refused to yield. Within the park, they called it something else, discipline of the impossible. Each day demanded faith in logic, in machinery, in the idea that reason itself could be moral. It was an idea that had saved Britain once and would soon begin to save the world. For Turing, the path forward was already shifting. The Bombay had proven that machines could think mechanically. Now he wondered if they could think creatively. As 1943 approached, with new allies arriving from America and the war tilting toward offense, he began drafting a report titled The Logical Basis of Intelligence. Its ideas belonged to no army, no nation. They belonged to the future. But the future was still being written in code. Outside, across the cold Atlantic, new wolf packs gathered, waiting for convoys that had not yet sailed. The Germans were preparing the next evolution of Enigma, a 4-rotor monster that would blind the Allies once again. And the minds of Bletchley Park, already pushed beyond exhaustion, would have to rise to meet it. The war of logic was far from over. The machines would keep turning, and with them, the men and women who had given up their names to think in silence. As 1943 began, the hum of Bletchley Park was louder than ever. The heartbeat of reason echoing through the dark, the sound of humanity refusing to surrender its mind. The ocean was black and endless. Under a sky stripped of stars, a convoy of merchant ships crawled across the Atlantic like a chain of dim embers. Their lights were shuttered, their engines throttled low, but the sea carried every sound. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a German U-boat listened. In its cramped control room, the operator leaned over a transmitter, typing out a burst of coded letters that flashed through the ether, 5 at a time, sharp and cold. The machine before him clattered, its rotors turning with the assurance of invincibility. The Enigma's message left no trace on the water, only silence, and then torpedoes. By dawn, the sea was burning. For Britain, 1942 brought no comfort. The Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest, most merciless campaign of the war. Every week, convoys vanished into fog and fire. Every day, the Admiralty's losses grew heavier. Supplies from America arrived only if they survived the 3,000 miles of water, patrolled by Admiral Karl Dunitz's U-boats, the wolf packs. These submarines hunted in coordinated groups, communicating by radio and attacking in waves. Their success depended on secrecy, and secrecy depended on Enigma. Bletchley Park had once kept pace with the ciphers, but that spring the rhythm stopped. The Germans had changed the game again. The new 4-rotor Enigma, introduced to the Navy's communications in early 1942, shattered the Allied advantage overnight. The additional rotor added 26 times the number of possible combinations, pushing the machine's permutations beyond what the bombs could reach in a single day. Overnight, the lights inside Hut 8 went dark. The codebreakers could still intercept the messages, but they could no longer read them. For the first time since the war began, Britain was deaf in the Atlantic. The effect was immediate. In March alone, 500,000 tons of Allied shipping went down. Tankers, troop ships, merchant vessels loaded with food and ammunition. Survivors drifted for days in lifeboats while destroyers searched empty seas. From Bletchley Park, there was nothing to send in return. "We can hear them talking," one analyst wrote, "but we can't understand what they're saying." Alan Turing took the failure personally. For months he had pushed the bombs to their mechanical limits, redesigning wiring, inventing shortcuts, calculating new permutations by hand. Now he stood before the silent machines and felt the familiar weight of impossibility settling again. He began working longer hours, cycling through rain and blackout to his hut before dawn, his coat soaked, his tea cold. The few who saw him during those weeks remembered the same expression, distant, unblinking, calculating what could not yet be calculated. The pressure was unbearable. Each unreadable message represented men dying at sea. In the Admiralty's war rooms, maps were marked with red pins for every lost ship. Churchill, who read the ultra-summaries each morning, stopped receiving them altogether. The only thing that ever really frightened me, he later said, was the U-boat peril. Inside Bletchley, morale broke before the code did. Some of the Wrens cried quietly at their posts. Others worked in silence until their fingers bled. The generators kept running, but the machines produced only noise. For the first time, the park's workers began to wonder if the enemy's faith in the unbreakable machine had finally been justified. Then, out on the freezing Atlantic, fate intervened. In May 1941, before the four-rotor Enigma had even appeared, a British destroyer had forced a U-boat, U-110, to surface after a depth charge attack. The German crew abandoned ship, believing it would sink. But it didn't, not immediately. A boarding party from HMS Bulldog climbed into the vessel and found the control room intact. On the desk lay the Enigma machine itself, still slick with seawater, alongside soaked codebooks and signal tables. They gathered everything, stuffed it into sacks, and escaped moments before the submarine finally went under. The captured material, preserved in secrecy, would later become priceless. Now, in 1942, with the new Enigma blinding them again, the codebreakers turned to those captured documents. Among the salvaged tables were the procedures for earlier months, outdated but not useless. They provided a glimpse into the structure of naval Enigma and the way its operators set their keys. Using these as a guide, Turing and his team began rebuilding their logic from the inside out. Each new intercept added data. Each failure narrowed the possibilities. The process was mechanical archaeology. They were digging through the layers of the machine's logic, searching for its new skeleton. Weeks passed before the first crack appeared. A message from a U-boat to headquarters contained a repeated letter pattern, a rare operator error. When run through the modified bomb, the machine paused. One lamp glowed. The result revealed part of the day's key. Not enough to read the message, but enough to prove the wall could be breached again. Within hours, the park roared back to life. "We are in the game again," Turing said simply, and returned to work. The Admiralty felt the difference almost immediately. By mid-1942, partial decrypts began reaching London again. They showed where wolf packs gathered, which routes were safe, and which convoys faced imminent attack. For the first time in months, the British Navy could plan rather than react. Ships were diverted around danger. U-boats found empty seas. Slowly, invisibly, the balance of the Atlantic began to shift. The human cost remained staggering. Merchant sailors still froze in the water, and rescue ships still sailed into ambushes. But behind every success, the shadow of Bletchley grew. Intelligence officers began referring to their invisible benefactors only as the Source. The crews who survived never knew that their salvation had begun, not on the bridge of a destroyer, but in a wooden hut miles from the sea. By late 1942, the four-rotor Enigma no longer terrified the cryptologists. It challenged them. They reconfigured the bombs to handle the extra wheel by isolating it and running partial searches for each of its 26 positions. The work was slower, but possible. Each day's solution took longer, but it came. The sound of the machines returned to its steady rhythm, the hum of methodical defiance. Bletchley Park was breathing again. Alan Turing, though relieved, was visibly exhausted. The months of strain had worn him down to silence. His colleagues noticed his absences, long walks by the lake, solitary meals, notebooks filled with unfinished equations. Yet his focus remained unbroken. He had begun training a new generation of mathematicians to manage the machines without him. The work was no longer one man's genius, but an industrial rhythm of intelligence. The machines had grown into an ecosystem, each feeding another. Britain had built the first true network of thinking machines, and Turing stood at its center, both master and prisoner of his own creation. Beyond Bletchley, the world was moving toward a broader front. In North Africa, Montgomery prepared his counter-offensive against Rommel. In Russia, the Wehrmacht bled itself dry in the snow. Across the Atlantic, American engineers joined the war, bringing new resources and new machines of their own. For Bletchley Park, this meant expansion on a scale no one had imagined possible. New facilities opened across the countryside: Eastcote, Stanmore, Wavendon, each housing lines of bombers operated by hundreds of wrens. The war of codes had become a factory of thought. Still, the sense of fragility never left them. Each new German innovation, each rumor of another cipher machine, another procedure, could erase months of work overnight. The enemy could not know how close they had come to victory by silence alone. Bletchley's greatest fear was discovery, that one careless operation, one intercepted convoy too neatly avoided, might reveal the existence of Ultra. Thus, restraint became a weapon as vital as logic. The codebreakers had to think not only of what they could learn, but what they could afford to show they knew. By the end of 1942, the tide had begun to turn. Convoy losses dropped. U-boat sinkings increased. The sea, once a grave, became a battlefield the Allies could navigate with unseen maps. In London, Churchill received the Ultra summaries again and circled one phrase in red: "The Germans do not suspect." For the men and women of Bletchley Park, there was no time to celebrate. The midnight keys changed, and the work began again. The machines hummed through the night, churning through the noise of the world until logic emerged, letter by letter, like light from beneath deep water. And somewhere in the Atlantic, a single U-boat, unaware that its words were already being read in an English country house, prepared to send another message. The operator straightened his uniform, pressed a key, and watched the lamps glow, confident, mechanical, unknowing. The signal leapt into the air, racing across the ocean to the ears of the enemy who was already listening. The war of codes had become a war of patience, and patience, at last, belonged to those who knew how to listen. The storm never really left the Atlantic. Even when the sea calmed, the radio waves above it crackled with invisible fire. Thousands of coded bursts linking U-boats to the heart of the Reich. The messages were short, clinical, almost impersonal. Positions, bearings, orders. Beneath each signal lay the same conviction that had guided Germany since the war began, that the Enigma was unbreakable. The operators believed it, their admirals believed it, and in that belief, they sailed blind into history. By early 1943, the confidence was beginning to rot. Convoys that should have vanished now arrived safely. Wolf packs that expected easy prey found only empty coordinates. The Germans blamed the weather, luck, even espionage among their allies, but never the machine itself. To admit that Enigma had failed was to admit that the foundation of their war, the logic of command, had been an illusion all along. The truth was worse. The enemy had learned to listen. At Bletchley Park, the victory was measured in silence. Every morning, couriers delivered intercepts from Y stations, stacks of 5-letter groups printed on endless paper rolls. The Wrens sorted, logged, and fed them to the bombs. The machines answered in rhythm, filling the huts with a constant electrical murmur. When a sequence stopped, an operator noted the settings, passed them to a checker, and the message moved up the chain. Within hours, it reached Hut 4, where linguists translated the decrypted text into English. The process had become almost ritual, mechanical yet reverent. Each decoded signal was treated as a small resurrection, something once dead brought back to meaning. What those translations revealed was the anatomy of a dying empire. German commanders complained of shortages, of convoys that slipped away, of submarines sunk without warning. One intercepted message reported that the U-boat U-559 had been lost in the Mediterranean. At the time, no one at Bletchley knew the details. Later, they learned the story, how the destroyer HMS Petard had forced the submarine to the surface, how 2 young sailors, Colin Grazier and Tony Fasson, had dived into the flooding vessel to retrieve code books before it sank. They passed the documents up through the hatch to a 3rd seaman before the boat went under, taking both men with it. The papers, still wet, reached Bletchley within days. They contained the daily key settings for the 4-rotor Enigma. The men who had died never knew that they had unlocked the sea. That single act changed the tempo of the entire war. Within weeks, Hut 8 could read naval Enigma almost as quickly as the Army and Air Force ciphers. The convoys, once blind, now sailed guided by intelligence that the enemy did not know existed. The Admiralty began routing ships through corridors of safety invisible on any map. U-boats found themselves ambushed by destroyers waiting in silence. It was the first time the hunters became the hunted. For the men and women of Bletchley Park, it was vindication, but no relief. The work did not lessen, it multiplied. Each new key captured demanded thousands of messages to be read, cross-checked, and analyzed before the day's end. Every night at midnight, the Germans changed their settings again, and the race began anew. The bombers never stopped. The sound of their rotation filled the park day and night, a steady pulse that became indistinguishable from breath. The operators learned to sleep through it, to think through it, to hear in it the measure of their own endurance. Alan Turing moved between the huts like a ghost of logic, appearing without warning, explaining a formula in half sentences, then vanishing back into thought. He seemed older, though he was barely 30. His colleagues noticed that he had begun spending long stretches alone by the lake after midnight, tracing equations in the condensation on the glass of his watch. To some, it seemed eccentric. To others, a kind of quiet grief. He had built machines to think like humans, and in doing so, had learned how much thought could cost. The victory at sea had come not from luck, nor from brute force, but from abstraction, from the marriage of mathematics and will. For the first time, the invisible had conquered the visible. But that triumph came with a new paradox. Those who had saved the convoys could never claim them. When Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic the dominating factor of the war, he never mentioned Bletchley Park by name. He couldn't. The codebreakers heard his speeches over the radio like any other citizens, sitting among the hum of their machines, smiling quietly to themselves. Their reward was continuation. More intercepts, more bombers, more sleepless nights. And in those nights came the moral unease that haunted every cryptologist. The awareness that they were reading the enemy's mind and, in a sense, his death warrant. Some messages contained positions of rescue ships that were deliberately left unacted upon to protect Ultra's secret. To intervene too perfectly would have revealed their advantage. The park's motto became unspoken but understood. We must not win too clearly. It was a logic colder than the machines themselves. In the spring of 1943, the results could no longer be denied. U-boat losses soared. Convoy losses fell to their lowest since the war began. The tide of the Atlantic turned with the precision of mathematics. Bletchley Park began sending regular decrypts to Washington, where American codebreakers at Arlington Hall joined the expanding network. For the first time, Ultra was shared across an ocean, a secret alliance of logic. Turing himself traveled briefly to the United States to advise on new bomb designs, collaborating with engineers who built faster, larger machines capable of processing the German keys in a fraction of the time. The partnership fused two industrial powers into a single intelligence system. It would later define the world that followed. Yet even in victory, the codebreakers remained anonymous. Their letters home spoke of office work or clerical duties. They could not describe the nights when they watched the sea move in numbers, nor the days when those numbers became lives, saved or lost. Some married in secrecy, others aged decades in a few years. When exhaustion claimed them, replacements arrived quietly, trained in the same silence. The park itself had become a living code, infinite, recursive, self-sustaining. The war outside mirrored that rhythm. In North Africa, Ultra guided the Allied pursuit of Rommel. In the Atlantic, it allowed American destroyers to strike where the U-boats least expected. The Germans never realized that their enemy was reading every signal, every maneuver, as if watching from inside their command posts. By the time they suspected anything, it was too late. The four-rotor Enigma, the masterpiece of their engineers, had become their downfall. But for the people inside Bletchley, the cost of knowing was isolation. They were forbidden to share what they saw, even with those fighting the battles they influenced. When news arrived that a convoy had survived, they could not say, "We saved them." When another was lost, they could not confess that they had known and been unable to act. The weight of secrecy pressed harder than the fatigue of work. One cryptanalyst later recalled, "We lived in silence so long that it became part of our nature." Alan Turing bore that silence more heavily than most. He had glimpsed what few could understand, that the principles guiding the bomb could guide more than war. He began to imagine machines that would not just search for answers, but store and alter instructions, machines that could, in theory, learn. He sketched notes between decrypts, lines of thought that stretched far beyond 1943. Around him, the world was consumed by battle. Inside his mind, the post-war future was already beginning to take shape. For now, the work continued. Bletchley's huts glowed late into the night, their windows shuttered against the blackout. The air smelled of oil and rain. The floorboards trembled with the weight of the machines. Somewhere, a wren laughed briefly before the noise swallowed her voice. Across the Atlantic, convoys sailed under the protection of intelligence no one could name. The codebreakers, faceless and unseen, had become the architects of silence, and from that silence came victory. When spring turned to summer, the reports from the Admiralty changed tone. The U-boat threat, once existential, was now contained. The losses that had terrified Churchill for 3 years had fallen by half. then by half again. The war at sea was still brutal, but it was no longer hopeless. The Atlantic was open. Britain could breathe. In the classified files of the Admiralty, one notation recorded the reason for the change: intelligence derived from special sources. It was the only acknowledgement Bletchley Park would receive. That was enough, because within those huts, beneath the whirring machines and the smell of damp paper, they had proven something greater than victory, that the mind, disciplined and unseen, could defeat any engine built to conceal the truth. The War of the Atlantic had ended not with a roar, but with the steady hum of the bombs, the sound of human reason reclaiming the sea. The desert seemed endless. From the cockpit of a reconnaissance plane, the sand below looked like a pale ocean without wind, a shifting expanse that could swallow armies whole. Beneath that silence moved the last remnants of the German Africa Corps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His tanks carved tracks through the dunes toward Egypt, their movements disciplined, almost graceful. To his soldiers, he was a legend. To the British, he was a phantom. He struck without warning, retreated without trace, and vanished into the heat haze as if the desert itself obeyed him. But by 1942, the Fox had been cornered, not by soldiers or tanks, but by mathematicians who had never seen a battlefield. At Bletchley Park, the rhythm of the war had changed. The roar of the bombers had become as constant as breathing. The enemy's codes no longer arrived as mysteries, but as challenges. Each morning, the Wrens wound the machines and listened for the telltale pause that signaled a key found. Each evening, the decrypted messages reached London under the label Ultra Secret. From there, they travelled further still, across cables, across continents, until they reached the dusty tent of a British general named Bernard Montgomery. It was the first time in history that generals fought with the enemy's plans in their hands before the battle began. The chain between Bletchley and the desert was long, invisible, and precise. Messages intercepted by Y stations in Egypt and Malta were transmitted to England, decrypted within hours, then summarized and returned through coded cables. From these invisible exchanges came the shape of entire campaigns. The codebreakers in Buckinghamshire knew when Rommel lacked fuel, when his supply convoys left Italy, even when he requested more tires. They watched his army starve through the language of intercepted complaints. "The desert," one linguist wrote, "is speaking to us in German." The effect was decisive. Every week, convoys carrying Rommel's supplies sailed from Naples and Palermo across the Mediterranean. Ultra revealed their departure times, routes, and escorts. British submarines and aircraft waited in ambush. The Italian ships rarely reached Africa. Without fuel, Rommel's tanks became monuments of sand. Without ammunition, his army's famous mobility turned into paralysis. In the desert, where distance was survival, immobility meant defeat. The victory that followed was not the product of overwhelming force. It was the product of information. When Montgomery launched his offensive at El Alamein in late 1942, his army was outnumbered in tanks, but not in knowledge. Ultra had already told him where Rommel would strike, how many guns he had, and where his lines were weakest. The battle unfolded almost as if it had been rehearsed. When Rommel retreated, Montgomery pursued, guided by reports that arrived not from scouts, but from Bletchley Park. The campaign's outcome changed the war. The North African desert became the Allies' first theatre of true momentum, the first place the British flag advanced rather than retreated. The newspapers called it redemption. In reality, it was calculation. Behind the headlines of valor and sacrifice, lay a network of women hunched over machines in a quiet English mansion, their fingers smudged with ink and graphite. The world saw generals. History would later see algorithms. Back in Buckinghamshire, the park was reaching its breaking point. What had begun as a few huts had become a labyrinth of departments and procedures. By 1943, more than 7,000 people worked at Bletchley and its satellite sites. New buildings rose in the fields, connected by gravel paths and humming telephone wires. Trains brought in food, paper, and new recruits. Trucks carried out intelligence summaries that would travel directly to Whitehall and Allied headquarters. The park was no longer merely a code-breaking station. It was an empire of information. Inside the huts, the pace was relentless. Every hour mattered, because every message expired at midnight when the Germans changed their keys. Linguists translated at impossible speed. Typists retyped decrypts on carbon copies until their wrists ached. Analysts compared messages line by line, searching for patterns of movement across entire continents. Each message was a pulse in a living network. Berlin, Tunis, Athens, Cairo, Moscow, all connected by the same invisible veins of radio and the same machine at their core. Turing's machines had evolved too. Dozens of Bombays now operated in unison across multiple sites, their results coordinated by couriers and telephone lines. The work had outgrown its creator. Turing himself had moved on to new projects, sharing leadership with Hugh Alexander and Stuart Milner Barry, while continuing to refine mathematical approaches to ciphers. He spoke less of Enigma and more of machines that could adapt. His mind, restless and prophetic, was already stepping beyond the war it was helping to win. The British were no longer alone. In 1943, the Americans entered the intelligence war in full, establishing a direct link between Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall in Washington. Engineers across the Atlantic began building faster bombs based on Turing's design, powered by American industry and British logic. The cooperation was cautious at first, two nations sharing their most guarded secret, but soon became indispensable. It was the birth of a partnership that would outlive the war itself. For those still inside the huts, the expansion brought both relief and disquiet. Relief because the weight of the work was finally shared. Disquiet because the anonymity grew deeper. Each person now performed only a fraction of the process, often without knowing how their fragment connected to the whole. It was like being part of a vast brain. One analyst later wrote, "You never saw the face, but you felt it thinking through you." Outside the gates, the war raged on in familiar chaos. London still burned under the V-bomb raids. Families still waited for letters that would never come. But within the walls of Bletchley Park, order prevailed. An order built on the quiet certainty that thought, when organized, could overcome anything. The discipline was total. Even success had to be hidden. Reports describing the defeat of Rommel carried no hint of their origin. They were signed simply Source Ultra. Yet the burden of silence was heavy. Operators who had spent months intercepting German distress signals from sinking ships sometimes recognized the same call signs weeks later, now sending nothing. Translators who read the enemy's personal letters learned the rhythm of grief from the other side. Some carried the weight in humor, others in stoic silence. The war of intelligence was fought as much within the self as against the enemy. Among the thousands of women who filled the huts, a new camaraderie formed. A quiet solidarity among those who knew the war's truest secret and could never tell it. They worked, laughed, wept, and waited together under a vow of silence that would last decades. Many would go to their graves without ever admitting what they had done. They called it simply the job. Through their hands passed the details of history, plans for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, estimates of troop strength in Tunisia, predictions of German retreat through Libya. Ultra guided them all. In a single year, the output of Bletchley Park turned from defense to offense. The Allies were no longer reacting to Hitler's moves. They were dictating them. The power of information had become indistinguishable from power itself. When the Joint Intelligence Committee met in London, its decisions rested not on speculation, but on lines of decrypted German text, orders, positions, complaints, and doubts. The voices of the enemy shaped Allied strategy more than any general's intuition. Every battle was fought twice, once in the mind, once in the field. By the time the guns fired, the outcome had often already been written, but with knowledge came a new kind of unease. The analysts of Bletchley Park began to realize that the war was creating something far larger than victory, a world where information would forever be the ultimate weapon. The systems they had built to fight tyranny were too effective, too powerful to be unmade. The boundaries between war and science, between secrecy and governance, were dissolving. The war of codes had created an empire of data. For now, none of that mattered. There was still work to do, convoys to protect, and battles to win. The nights at Bletchley Park remained long, the air thick with the hum of the bombs. The operators still marked each halt with a quiet cheer, still folded their findings into brown envelopes marked top secret, still sent them into the dawn where generals waited for answers. Outside, the desert winds shifted. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was now retreating westward, leaving behind burned tanks and empty oil drums. From Cairo to Casablanca, from London to Washington, a single truth began to take hold. That the tide had turned, not with steel or fire, but with thought. And in the quiet hours before morning, when the last generator finally slowed, the mathematicians of Bletchley Park allowed themselves a rare, fragile peace. For the first time in years, they believed the war could end, and that when it did, the machines would fall silent, and the world would hear, at last, how reason had saved it. The noise of victory was not the crash of artillery, but the murmur of electricity. By 1943, the halls of Bletchley Park vibrated with it, a mechanical pulse that never stopped. From dawn until far past midnight, the bombs turned and clicked, shredding through millions of possibilities, while the operators waited for the moment when a lamp froze in triumph. The sound echoed through the huts like breath itself, steady and unbroken. Some said you could tell the time by it. Others said you could forget what time meant. What began as a handful of code breakers in wooden huts had become an industrial labyrinth of intelligence. More than 9,000 men and women now worked at Bletchley and its satellite stations. Motorbikes brought intercepts every hour. Couriers carried summaries to London before the ink dried. Each message passed through a chain so vast and so disciplined that it seemed less a workplace than an organism, a single mind divided among thousands of bodies. No one called it that, but everyone felt it. The park was thinking. Its thoughts reached far beyond Britain. Across the Atlantic, in the suburbs of Washington, the Americans had built their own fortress of secrecy at Arlington Hall. Engineers there were assembling new bombs based on Turing's design, faster and more precise than anything the British factories could produce. The first cables between the two centers carried the same refrain: cooperation essential, secrecy absolute. It was a union forged not by treaty but by logic. Each side needed the other's strength, British method, American industry, and neither could afford mistrust. The partnership would become the spine of modern intelligence. Turing was chosen to travel to America to oversee the work. He left England in the middle of winter, the sea still thick with U-boats, his passage protected by the very information he had helped uncover. The journey took weeks. When he arrived in New York, the world above ground glittered with neon. Below, in laboratories filled with the smell of oil and ozone, the future waited. At Bell Labs and the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory in Dayton, he met engineers who could build his ideas at a scale he had only imagined. Together, they created bomb bays that spun 3 times faster than those in Britain, powered by banks of vacuum tubes and industrial motors. For the first time, machinery was outpacing thought. Turing's time in America was brief but transformative. He saw what happened when computation met mass production, when abstract logic became factory rhythm. To his hosts, he was courteous but distant, always half elsewhere, filling notebooks with equations that had nothing to do with Enigma. He wrote to colleagues in England about machines that could be instructed to alter their own instructions. The words sounded theoretical then. They would not remain so for long. Back in Britain, the fruits of that alliance appeared almost immediately. By mid-1943, the combined network of bomb bays on both sides of the Atlantic was breaking hundreds of German keys each week. Messages that once took days to read now reached the Admiralty within hours. The war of reaction had become a war of anticipation. Allied convoys sailed under the invisible escort of intelligence. Commanders could predict U-boat formations before they appeared on radar. For the first time in 4 years, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. But while the ocean grew safer, the war itself was widening. Hitler's armies retreated in Russia, and in Europe, the Allies prepared for a return to the continent. The success of that invasion would depend not only on soldiers or ships, but on the same silent network that had saved Britain. Signals, codes, deception. Ultra-intelligence would have to expand again, from seas to continents, from defense to strategy. The expansion came at a price. Inside Bletchley Park, the pressure became constant, almost physical. Each new front meant new ciphers, new procedures, new languages. Messages poured in from Africa, Italy, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front. Rooms filled with maps and strings of coloured pins, marking troop movements deduced from decrypts. Analysts worked in 12-hour shifts, collapsing onto camp beds between rotations. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and carbon paper. Some began to dream in 5-letter groups. When one woke screaming after murmuring QFXTZ, no one even laughed. They all knew what it meant to drown in code. Yet amid exhaustion, there was elation. For the first time, the people of Bletchley could see the shape of victory forming through the data. Reports from Ultra showed German supply shortages, troop withdrawals, fuel crises. Each weakness revealed itself through a pattern, and each pattern could be exploited. War, once chaos, had become legible. Turing's machines had turned the enemy's confidence into mathematics, and mathematics, in turn, into strategy. Still, there were boundaries that even success could not cross. Secrecy remained absolute. Every document that left the park was stripped of context, translated into neutral phrases, and disguised by intermediaries before reaching Allied commanders. No one outside the innermost circle knew that Ultra existed. Montgomery in Africa received reports labelled from a reliable source. Eisenhower in London would later say that he had never asked where his intelligence came from, only that it kept arriving. Among the code breakers, secrecy bred intimacy and isolation in equal measure. Couples formed in the huts and ended in silence. Friendships thrived within the boundaries of clearance and vanished outside them. When workers left the park for leave, the normal world felt unreal. Slow, uncoordinated, meaningless. Some returned home, unable to explain why they couldn't sleep in quiet rooms anymore. The hum of the bomb bays had become part of their hearts. One of the analysts in Hut 3 kept a small diary hidden behind a radiator. In it, she wrote, "The enemy sends orders to kill. We send orders to save. Our machines spin faster than theirs. That is our only mercy." Her words captured what no official report could. The sense that intelligence had become conscience. The machines themselves evolved. New designs incorporated relay logic and switching systems far more advanced than anything Scherbius had dreamed when he built the first Enigma. In secret workshops, engineers experimented with electronic circuits that could remember previous states, a primitive form of memory. No one used that word then, but it marked a threshold. The moment when machinery began to imitate not just calculation, but recollection. Outside Bletchley's fences, the war had entered its final, feverish phase. The Allies bombed Germany's industrial heartlands. The Soviets pushed west. America prepared for invasion. Every operation drew on the same hidden current of information. Ultra had become so deeply woven into planning that the war could no longer exist without it. It was no longer an advantage. It was infrastructure. By late 1943, preparations for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe, were underway. Every deception, every feint, every coded signal depended on what Bletchley could provide, proof that the enemy still believed in false targets and phantom armies. The mathematicians became, in effect, authors of illusion. They crafted radio traffic designed to deceive the very system they had spent years dismantling. It was a strange symmetry. To win the final battle, they had to teach the Germans to trust their own codes again. That winter, Turing returned from America. He found Bletchley almost unrecognizable, larger, louder, consumed by its own success. He resumed his post quietly, walking through the corridors like a visitor to a city he had once founded. The machines no longer amazed him. They were inevitable now. What interested him were ideas beyond Enigma, how logic itself might be mechanized completely, how memory and instruction could coexist within a single system. He spoke rarely of these thoughts, but they filled his notebooks in the margins between decrypts. The first outlines of the digital age were being drafted between raids and ration queues. In February 1944, Churchill sent another personal note to Bletchley Park. It was short and typical of him. "Action this day. Give these people everything they need." The Prime Minister, who had once feared Britain's annihilation, now owed its survival to the quiet hum of machines. He would never say so publicly, but he knew. The geese had not only laid golden eggs, they had built the nest in which victory would hatch. Still, within the park, no one dared imagine the end. Every midnight reset of Enigma reminded them that certainty lasted only 24 hours. When the lights dimmed and the drums began to turn again, they returned to their desks, fingers on pencils, eyes on the lamps, waiting for another glimmer of sense in the noise. Outside, in the war rooms of London and Washington, the decrypts continued to arrive, sheets of German text rendered meaningless by success. The commanders saw only the summaries, never the faces behind them. But if they had listened carefully, they might have heard the real music of the war, the endless rhythm of bombs turning, of pencils scratching, of minds refusing to rest. The tide had turned, and the current was carrying history toward its reckoning. In a few months, the largest invasion in human history would begin, guided not by luck or prophecy, but by the patient intelligence born in a quiet English mansion. And when that day came, no one outside Bletchley Park would know that the war had already been decided. Letter by letter, circuit by circuit, in the mind of a machine. For months, nothing moved on the southern coast of England except the wind through barbed wire and the slow procession of soldiers gathering for a battle no one dared name. The towns of Portsmouth and Southampton were sealed off, their harbours packed with ships whose destinations were marked only by tides and secrecy. Across the Channel, the Germans waited too, confident, restless, listening. Between them, in the grey static of the airwaves, a new kind of war was being fought. It was not a battle of armies, but of messages, and Bletchley Park was the field. By 1944, the park had grown into a world unto itself, a city of logic under perpetual fog, its huts spread in every direction, connected by corridors of cables and mud. At night, their windows glowed behind blackout curtains, the hum of the bomb bays blending with the distant thunder of training exercises. The people who worked there no longer spoke of victory or defeat. They spoke in time signatures, the 24-hour rhythm of Enigma, the midnight reset that erased each day's labor. Yet as spring came, the pattern began to change. For the first time, they were not fighting to survive. They were preparing to end the war. The assault on Nazi Europe, Operation Overlord, would be the largest amphibious invasion in history, and its success would depend on one illusion: that the Germans believed the Allies were landing somewhere else. Bletchley's decrypts revealed that Hitler expected the attack at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The challenge was to make him stay certain. To do so, the British created an empire of deception, Operation Bodyguard, a web of double agents, false radio traffic, and phantom divisions. Every strand of that illusion ran through Bletchley Park. Each day, new Enigma intercepts confirmed what the enemy believed. Each night, new false messages were crafted to strengthen that belief. It was a duel of perception, and the codebreakers were the invisible directors of a play the Germans did not know they were watching. Their work determined not only what the enemy saw, but what he could not imagine. In Hut 3, linguists studied every intercepted conversation between German command posts, measuring tone and vocabulary as if parsing literature. The level of certainty in an adjective, the absence of a question mark, these became indicators of belief. When Hitler's headquarters referred to expected landings at Calais, the analysts knew the deception was working. When he ordered panzer divisions north instead of west, they knew the illusion was perfect. Meanwhile, Hut 6 and Hut 8 continued their assault on daily Enigma keys. The volume of intercepts had become unthinkable, thousands per hour. Whole huts existed only to sort, tag, and route the traffic. New teams of mathematicians handled the pure logic. Engineers maintained the bombs in rotating shifts. The atmosphere was not of victory, but of orchestration. Everything had to align. Each decrypted signal shaped another signal, which shaped another movement, which would one day become history. In April, the tone of German transmissions changed. The decrypts from Normandy's coastal defences grew nervous. Weather reports multiplied. Officers discussed fuel shortages and incomplete fortifications. The analysts recognized the rhythm of fear. They knew what it meant. The Germans were preparing for something, but not this. They still looked north, to Calais. The deception held. The Allies used that blindness ruthlessly. Through the spring, ultra-intelligence guided the bombing of railway lines, bridges, and communication centres in occupied France. The goal was not only to weaken defences, but to isolate Normandy, without revealing why. Every raid was calculated from Bletchley's decrypts, which German units had moved, which supply depots were vulnerable, which bridges were still guarded by the Luftwaffe. The logic of war had become logistical. Destroy not the army, but its capacity to move. At the center of it all, Alan Turing and his colleagues in Hut 8 refined their work to near automation. The bombs now ran continuously across Britain, joined by the faster American models. The machines no longer paused between tasks. They flowed from one key search to another. The staff called them the choir, a constant chorus of metallic voices, each drumming toward revelation. When a lamp flickered, it was like a note struck in harmony. The sound filled the park day and night, endless, exact, unstoppable. For the code breakers, exhaustion became a kind of clarity. They lived on tea, adrenaline, and the belief that their invisible work would spare the visible world from destruction. They knew no details, only fragments. Army West moving north, Panzer reserves repositioned, weather stations confirming high winds. Each piece meant little in isolation. Together, they formed the map of an empire collapsing in real time. Then, in the first week of June, the signals fell silent. For 3 days, almost no German traffic reached the Y stations. The airwaves, once alive with chatter, became blank. Inside Bletchley Park, anxiety spread. Some feared that the Germans had changed systems again. Others guessed the truth. The silence meant waiting. The invasion was near. On the evening of June 5th, 1944, rain swept across southern England. The invasion fleet, over 5,000 ships, waited for a break in the weather. In the huts, the bombers continued to turn, monitoring the last German intercepts. Shortly after midnight, the storm eased. Reports from the coast confirmed minimal Luftwaffe patrols. The Germans had not shifted their focus. The deception still held. At 3 a.m., the first paratroopers jumped into darkness. At 5:30, Allied ships opened fire on the beaches of Normandy. And at Bletchley Park, the operators kept working, feeding the airwaves through the machines, searching for the enemy's response. It came slowly, confused, and fragmented. Messages from German field posts spoke of limited attacks and possible diversionary landings. One intercept, decrypted within hours, recorded a commander in Calais insisting that the main attack is yet to come. The park erupted in quiet relief. The Germans still believed the lie. For 48 hours, Hitler held back his panzer reserves in the north, waiting for an assault that would never arrive. Those 2 days became the difference between success and disaster. By June 7th, as Allied forces secured the beaches, the silence at Bletchley broke into a storm of work. Messages flooded in from every front. Panicked reports from occupied France, confused orders from Berlin, desperate requests for fuel and reinforcements. The Enigma, once a weapon of order, now transmitted chaos. The Reich's communications network had become a mirror of its own disintegration. Within weeks, Bletchley Park's role shifted from anticipation to pursuit. Each decoded message revealed retreat, not advance. Withdrawals from Normandy, evacuations from the French coast, reassignments that arrived too late. The Allies were now inside the rhythm of the enemy's thought. Every attempt at reorganization appeared in their decrypts before it could take effect. The Enigma Empire was collapsing not by invasion alone, but by comprehension. Alan Turing watched this unfold with a strange detachment. He had never been sentimental about victory. To him, each message read was simply another equation solved. Yet even he sensed that something irreversible had happened. For years, he had fought a machine designed to hide the truth. Now the machine was revealing not only its secrets, but its fragility. It had been built on the assumption that men would always think slower than metal. Bletchley Park had proved the opposite. As summer turned to autumn, the Allies pushed east through France. The bombes continued to run, decrypting the remains of an empire that still believed it was secure. Every intercepted message was a confession, evidence of a system that had outlived its certainty. By the time the first Allied troops crossed the Seine, the Enigma was no longer the symbol of invincibility. It was the echo of a past the war was already leaving behind. When news of Paris's liberation reached the park in August, no one cheered. The workers simply paused, read the bulletin, and returned to their desks. There were still messages to decode, still convoys to protect, still deaths to prevent. Victory, like code breaking, was incremental. It arrived not with revelation, but with persistence. In the huts of Bletchley Park, the machines kept turning, the pencils kept moving, and the war of words continued, now against an enemy who no longer believed his own. The war that had begun in code was ending the same way, in fragments of light and static. By the winter of 1944, the messages arriving at Bletchley Park no longer carried confidence. Gone were the crisp reports of victories and timetables. Now the intercepts were filled with confusion, desperate calls for fuel, complaints about discipline, lists of losses so long they blurred into repetition. The language of conquest had turned into the language of collapse. Outside the huts, Britain itself had changed. The blackout curtains were fraying. Ration queues had become habit. But in the countryside, under the same low clouds that had hung there since 1939, the code breakers kept working. Their enemy was no longer invincible. It was disorganized, erratic, wounded, yet still dangerous. Every decrypted message was another step into the ruins of an empire that refused to accept it was dying. After D-Day, the German military communications network began to devour itself. Units retreated faster than orders could reach them. New ciphers were introduced and discarded before anyone learned to use them. The once precise structure of Enigma was collapsing under its own weight. At Bletchley, analysts found that messages which had once taken hours to solve now fell open in minutes. The rotors that had guarded the Reich for a decade now revealed its disintegration. The machine built for perfection was ending in disorder. And yet the work continued with the same intensity. Every day, hundreds of fresh intercepts arrived from the advancing fronts. Reports from the Ardennes, from the Rhine, from cities whose names were now battlefields. Even as Allied armies liberated France and Belgium, the flow of German signals never ceased. Hitler's headquarters, buried in its bunker, still issued orders as if the war could be managed by command. It was the final illusion of control. Inside Hut 6, the daily decrypts became almost surreal. Messages ordered non-existent divisions to reinforce positions that no longer existed. Supply requests went unanswered because the units they were addressed to had already been captured or destroyed. The code breakers read them in silence, knowing they were witnessing the collapse of a system that had once seemed eternal. It was like reading the diary of a dying man, one analyst wrote years later. The bomb machines kept turning until the very end. Their rhythm, once urgent, now sounded weary, an old heartbeat still doing its duty. The wrens who operated them had grown used to the constant hum, the smell of oil and carbon. Some had been there since the beginning. Others had joined only months earlier, unaware that they were arriving in the final chapter of the war. They worked as they always had, methodically, precisely, without rest, because no one at Bletchley was allowed to imagine that the end might be near. Then, in early 1945, the messages changed tone again. For the first time, the intercepts included words of panic. Some German operators transmitted in clear text, abandoning encryption entirely. Others used Enigma keys so hastily assembled that they repeated settings from weeks earlier. The discipline that had once defined the Reich's communications was gone. Entire sections of the German command had stopped believing that secrecy mattered. The decrypts from Berlin were the most haunting. One series of messages recorded the evacuation of government ministries. Another, the destruction of archives. The analysts realized that the Germans were burning their own history before it could be captured. One message, sent by the Foreign Office, ordered that all cipher equipment be destroyed to the last machine. The same order that had once created Enigma was now condemning it to death. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Bletchley Park intercepted one of the final transmissions from Hitler's command. It was short, curt, and meaningless, an instruction to reposition non-existent troops. When the decrypt appeared, a young woman in Hut 3 read it twice before setting it aside. "There's nothing left to move," she said quietly, and returned to work. The fall of the Reich was charted not by headlines, but by silence. The intercepts thinned, then stopped altogether. Stations that had once filled the air with coded chatter fell mute one by one. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the last messages arrived in plain German. Acknowledgements of defeat, confirmations of ceasefire, orders to stand down. After 6 years, the language of secrecy gave way to the simplest word in any language: enough. At Bletchley Park, there were no celebrations. The workers stood outside the huts, blinking in the sunlight they had almost forgotten, and waited for new instructions. None came. The machines were switched off one by one, their drums slowing, their hum fading into the stillness of summer. The silence that followed was so deep that some said it rang in their ears. For years, the park had lived in the rhythm of its own machinery. Now, suddenly, it was over. Alan Turing watched the shutdown with quiet detachment. He had seen the end coming long before anyone else. Not the end of the war, but the end of purpose. The work that had defined his life, that had justified secrecy and exhaustion, was finished. The bombs would be dismantled, their parts repurposed or destroyed. The men and women who had built the most advanced intelligence network in history would disperse back into ordinary life, forbidden to speak of what they had done. Victory, for them, meant erasure. The final directive arrived under the seal of the Official Secrets Act. All documents, diagrams, and notes related to Ultra were to be destroyed. Machines were disassembled with hammers. Wiring was melted down for scrap. The park that had once housed the beating heart of Allied intelligence became a collection of empty huts echoing with memories of code. Those who had served there returned to their cities and villages, carrying a silence that would last decades. The world beyond had no idea. Newspapers celebrated the generals, the soldiers, the pilots. Bletchley Park was never mentioned. Its workers received no medals, no parades, no thanks. They vanished back into the crowd, their war invisible, their victory classified. Only the faint smell of oil and paper remained in the rooms where history had been rewritten. And yet, beneath the secrecy, something irreversible had happened. In their pursuit of Enigma, the codebreakers had built more than machines. They had built a new way of thinking. They had proven that logic could shape destiny, that information could be as decisive as force. The same principles that had defeated the Reich would soon define the world to come. a world where codes, not borders, held power. Alan Turing left Bletchley quietly, returning to his work in mathematics. He no longer built bombs, but studied the nature of computation itself, the theoretical offspring of the machines that had won the war. To him, the victory had never been about nations. It had been about possibility. The Enigma had been broken, but what it revealed was not just the fallibility of one empire. It was the beginning of a new kind of intelligence. In the years that followed, the name Ultra would remain secret. Bletchley's existence was buried beneath government files, its story untold. But within those files lay the record of something miraculous. A war ended not only by courage and sacrifice, but by thought itself. When the park finally fell silent in the summer of 1945, the air still smelled faintly of oil and ozone. The lights of the bomb bays had gone out, but in their place, an idea remained. That machines could think, that knowledge could save, and that silence could be the loudest victory of all. As the last Enigma messages faded from the air, the silence that replaced them was almost unbearable. For 6 years, the hum of the bomb bays had been the heartbeat of Britain's survival. Now, as the machines were dismantled and the huts emptied, the air itself seemed hollow. The people of Bletchley Park, those thousands who had lived in secrecy and routine, stood before their silent workrooms and felt what soldiers must feel when the guns stop. Relief, disbelief, and a strange kind of loss. They had spent the war defeating an empire that believed in perfection, a regime that worshipped order and precision. They had answered it with something even more precise, logic itself. And yet, when victory came, there were no parades for them. They signed one final paper, the Official Secrets Act, and disappeared into the ordinary world. To their families, they were clerks, typists, and radio operators. Their true history would remain buried for more than 30 years. For a time, the world forgot that the mind had been its greatest weapon. Alan Turing left Bletchley Park before the gates closed for good. He had done what he set out to do, but the problem he had solved refused to leave him. In the bomb's spinning drums, he had glimpsed something larger than war, the possibility of a machine that could think. If a device could simulate every step of reasoning needed to defeat Enigma, could it not also simulate any act of reasoning at all? That question followed him back to Cambridge, then to Manchester, and into the foundations of a new science. He called it computability. For the first time in history, a human being had imagined thought as a process that could be built. The world he returned to was already changing. Governments across Europe and America realized that Ultra had created a weapon more potent than bombs or armies: the mastery of information. The same methods that had decrypted Hitler's empire could now read the messages of new enemies. The Cold War had begun, and secrecy became its first language. Bletchley Park was reborn in fragments under new names: GCHQ in Britain, the NSA in the United States. The huts were gone, but their echoes filled every new listening post built to monitor the planet. The victory that had depended on a handful of mathematicians in 1940 would, within a decade, depend on entire nations built around the same principle. Whoever controls the code controls the world. For the people who had lived it, silence became habit. Mavis Beatty married and raised a family without ever mentioning that she had once cracked the Italian naval cipher. The Wrens, who had operated the bombers, returned to lives of teaching, nursing, and motherhood, each carrying an unspoken past. When old friends asked what they had done during the war, they smiled and changed the subject. Some said office work. Others said nothing at all. The discipline that had kept Ultra secret outlived the need for secrecy. It became a way of being. Turing did not adapt so easily. The war had proven his brilliance, but the peace exposed his difference. In 1952, he was prosecuted for homosexuality, then a crime in Britain. The same government that had entrusted him with the nation's greatest secret now stripped him of his security clearance. Forced into silence of another kind, he turned again to mathematics. His last papers explored patterns in biology, the mathematics of life itself, as if he were still trying to find order within chaos. 2 years later, he was found dead in his home, an apple laced with cyanide beside his bed. Whether the act was deliberate or accidental, no one could say. He was 41. The man who had given logic its humanity died alone, without recognition, his work still classified. It would take half a century for the world to know his name. The secrecy that buried him also buried the story of Bletchley Park. For decades, history told the war as a tale of generals and battles, of Normandy and Stalingrad and Hiroshima. The invisible front, the war of codes, remained hidden beneath official silence. Yet the consequences of that invisible victory shaped everything that came after. The first computers built after the war drew directly from Bletchley's machinery. The logic circuits that had powered the bombers evolved into the architecture of digital computation. In the ruins of conflict, the modern world had been born. It began quietly, in rooms much like those huts that had once stood in the English countryside. At the National Physical Laboratory, engineers built ACE, the first prototype of Turing's universal machine. In America, similar projects, ENIAC, UNIVAC, IBM, followed the same blueprint, a device capable of remembering instructions and modifying them. The line between calculator and thinker blurred. What had once been a secret weapon of war became the engine of a new civilization. And yet, beneath the triumph of invention, lay the same moral unease that had haunted the codebreakers. Knowledge had given humanity power beyond measure, but not wisdom to match it. In the Cold War that followed, intelligence agencies monitored the world with the same methods that had once saved it. Secrecy became permanent, a peacetime religion. The huts of Bletchley had been dismantled, but the culture of silence endured. When the truth finally emerged in the 1970s, when the archives opened and the veterans could finally speak, the public was astonished. Historians estimated that Ultra had shortened the war by at least 2 years, perhaps more. Millions of lives saved, victories reversed, battles decided by invisible hands. Newspapers called it Britain's greatest secret. For those who had lived it, the attention felt strange. The work had always belonged to the shadows. To see it in daylight was like exposing a sacred language to noise. They spoke modestly, often reluctantly. Many of them still could not quite believe that what they had done mattered so much. "We only did our jobs," one of the Wrens said in an interview. It was the machines that were clever. She was wrong, of course. The machines had no will. They had only what the people who built them had given them: persistence, patience, and the refusal to stop thinking. The world they helped create was already transforming again. In 1975, the first personal computers appeared. Small boxes humming with the same principle that had once filled Bletchley Park. Logic circuits translating human intent into electric current. The future Turing had imagined in wartime isolation had become ordinary life. Each new generation of machine carried his invisible signature, even as his name remained obscure. The victory he had given the world was now the architecture of the world itself. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. In 1998, decades after his death, the British government declassified the final ultra files. In 2009, an online campaign led to an official apology for his persecution. 3 years later, the Queen granted him a posthumous pardon. The country that had condemned him finally honored him. Yet for many, the gesture felt like mathematics balancing a long unpaid debt. Nothing could change the fact that the man who had helped win the war had been destroyed by the peace. And still, his ideas endured. Every digital pulse, every algorithm, every coded message that crossed the air carried the legacy of Bletchley Park. The notion that machines could process thought had outlived the machines themselves. What began as an answer to Enigma had become the foundation of the information age. The world had inherited its own creation, an intelligence that never slept. But the inheritance came with a question that Turing himself might have asked. If logic can save humanity, can it also replace it? The same systems that once deciphered tyranny now defined privacy, power, and perception. The code war had ended, but the war for meaning continued. The line between liberation and surveillance blurred as it had in those secret huts. The tools of salvation had become tools of control. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Bletchley Park. Not triumph, but warning. That knowledge, once unchained, cannot be contained. That every secret solved creates another. That the same impulse to understand the world can make it unrecognizable. Yet for all the moral weight of what followed, something pure remained. In the quiet logic of those wartime nights, in the patience of the wrens, the determination of the mathematicians, the moral clarity of their purpose, there was a glimpse of what reason can be at its best, a refusal to yield to chaos, a faith that thought, not destruction, could end destruction. When visitors walk through Bletchley Park today, the machines no longer hum, but the silence carries memory. The air still smells faintly of oil and dust. The wires that once connected the huts are gone, yet the ground feels alive with what once passed through it, the first heartbeat of the modern mind. It is a strange kind of peace, not the peace of forgetting, but of understanding. From that silence came the age we now live in, the age of the algorithm, the code, the invisible conversation between man and machine. The war ended, but its idea never did. The same belief that saved the 20th century drives the 21st. That if you listen closely enough, every mystery can be solved. Perhaps it can, but some mysteries, as Bletchley's veterans would tell you, are not meant to be solved, only remembered.